Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be going over what I believe to be the Democrats' best case scenario in the 2022 midterms. Before I start, I'd like to say if you like my content, leave a like on the video and subscribe and turn on the notification bell to know when we upload. With all that said, let's get into it. So I'm going to start with the governor's map, and because this is the Democrats' best case, I'm going to fill in all of their solid states from my governor's video first. So we have California, Colorado, Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Hawaii, and Maryland. And I think that's it. Next, I'm going to be filling in the states that I think would still be solid Republican in the Democrats' best case scenario. So those would be Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Iowa, Ohio, Tennessee, Alabama, Vermont, and New Hampshire. And because this is the Democrats' best case scenario, I actually do have some solid states to add. I'm going to go through them now. First one being Minnesota. This one's already approaching a 10-point lead, in my opinion, for Tim Walz. In his best case scenario, he definitely wins by around 15 points. So I would call Minnesota solid Democrat in their best case scenario. Next up is the state of Michigan. Pretty similar story to Minnesota. Gretchen Whitmer's leading the polls by a lot. If the polls are right, she is going to win by a double-digit margin. I could see it happening, especially in the best-case scenario. She'd probably also win by around 15 points. Similar story in Pennsylvania. I don't think it's actually as lopsided as it seems in the polls right now, but let's say it is. Mastriano would lose by over 10 points. Shapiro would win by over 10 points. It would be solid Democrat. Next solid state I would add is the state of Maine. Mills is leading most polling by close to 10 points. In her best case scenario, she probably would win by over 10 points, so I'd call Maine solid Democrat. The final solid Democrat state I'm going to add is the state of New Mexico. Lujan Grisham is leading most polls against Ronchetti by a couple points, but New Mexico is a very blue state. We'll say in the best case scenario, Lujan Grisham would win by over 10 points. All right, next I'm going to go through the likely Republican states in the Democrats' best case scenario, and there are only a couple of these. The first one being South Dakota. This one's probably, in real life, going to be a very big win for Noem, but there have been some internal polling that shows that this race could be closer. So I think in the Democrats' best case scenario, they could knock Noem below 10 points, but she would still win by a pretty sizable margin. The final likely Republican state is going to be the state of South Carolina. South Carolina hasn't fallen below a 10-point margin for a Republican in a long time, but it almost did in 2020. So if 2022 were a really good Democrat year, it could fall below 10 for the Republican. So I would call it likely Republican. All right, next up, I'm going to fill in the likely Democrat states, of which there are only a few. The first one being Oregon. Oregon's a very blue state. Right now, Republican Christine Drazan is leading in the polls, but in this scenario, the polls would close in, Betsy Johnson would lose the third-party support, and most of that would go to Tina Kotek. And so she would end up winning probably by 7 or 8 points. So in the best-case scenario, I think Oregon is likely Democrat. The final likely Democrat state is going to be the state of Kansas. In 2018, Laura Kelly outperformed all expectations, and she won the state of Kansas by about 5 points to become the next governor. I could see it happening again. If she really outperforms all of the polls, she's already led some polls. She could increase her margin. I think Kansas would be likely Democrat in her best case scenario. All right, we have all the solid and likely states out of the way, so now I'm going to go through these toss-ups west to east, starting with Alaska. So the state of Alaska, it proved very recently that it can vote for a Democrat in extreme situations. Bill Walker, I think, would be the most likely left-wing candidate to win in Alaska, so he's going to be the de facto Democrat in this scenario. Even though he is technically an independent, he is still left-leaning. And he was the governor of Alaska, but he lost in 2018. Mike Dunleavy is the current governor. With their ranked choice voting system, I could see Walker narrowly winning, so I do think Alaska would be tilt Democrat in this scenario. Next up is the state of Nevada. Steve Sisolak is an incumbent, and although he is down in the polls right now, Republicans can underperform polls in Nevada sometimes. So we could see Steve Sisolak winning by around 4 points, I think, in his best case scenario. So I would call Nevada lean Democrat. Similar story in Arizona. Republicans can underperform polls, and although I do think Kari Lake is favored, Hobbs definitely can win this. So I do think Arizona would be lean Democrat in the best case scenario. As for the state of Texas, Beto O'Rourke is the Democratic nominee for governor, and he was able to get Texas close 4 years ago against Ted Cruz in the Senate race, but he's lost a lot of his popularity and he's just not that appealing of a candidate in Texas anymore. I do think he'd be able to get it close in the best case scenario. I still think he'd lose probably by around 4 points, so I'd call Texas lean Republican in the Democrats' best case scenario. In the state of Wisconsin, Tony Evers, of course, is the incumbent governor. The incumbency has that advantage, and although he is down in the polls right now, the polls in Wisconsin in 2018 were kind of okay. Some of them overestimated Republicans. We could say that he'd outperform the polls in Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin would be lean Democrat in his best case scenario. In the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp has held a steady lead over Stacey Abrams this entire cycle. It almost feels like she's given up. But I think Brian Kemp would very narrowly eke out a victory in in Stacey Abrams' best case scenario. She would be able to get it close. I just don't think she'd win. She's down by too much right now, and she's not campaigning very well. So I do think Kemp would still win in the Democrats' best case scenario. Finally, we have the state of Florida. Everyone knows Governor Ron DeSantis. He's got high approvals. He's been leading by double digits in a lot of the polls. This one will probably be a solid Republican race at the end of the day. But in the Democrats' best case scenario, I could see it dropping to around a 4-point victory for DeSantis. So I would call Florida lean Republican in this scenario. So this is what I think the Democrats' best case for the governor elections are: 26 Democrats to 24 Republicans. But I am also going to take a look at the best case for Democrats in the Senate. So in the Senate, I'm going to do what I did before and fill in all the solid Democrat states from my Senate video. And those are Oregon, California, Hawaii, Illinois, New York, Vermont, Connecticut, and Maryland. Next, I'm going to fill in the solid Republican states that I think would still be solid. Idaho, Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, both of Oklahoma's elections. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to put this special election in here. I changed my mind. We're going to put Arkansas in there, Louisiana, Indiana, Kentucky, Alabama, and I think that's it. Actually, I'm also going to put Alaska in there, but because Lisa Murkowski is the more left-leaning Republican who has a chance of victory there, we'll say that in this scenario, she does win. All right, so now I'm going to add any solid Democrat states that I don't have here already. The first one is going to be Colorado. Michael Bennet might win by over 10 points in real life in the actual outcome anyway, so I don't really have a problem with putting Colorado as solid Democrat in the best case scenario. It might happen anyway. Next up is the state of Washington, probably going to be closer than usual this year, but in the best case scenario, it will just vote in line how it normally does. Washington is a very blue state, and it's just kind of a surprise that it's been as close as it has been this year, but in the best case scenario, it will still be above 10, so Washington is another addition to this column. The final solid Democrat state that I'm adding is the state of New Hampshire. Don Bolduc is not a good fit for the state. Maggie Hassan isn't that popular, but let's say that all the Democrats shore up for her and a lot of independents break for her, I could see her winning by over 10 points. All right, now I'm going to fill in the likely Democrat states, starting with Pennsylvania. John Fetterman has had a pretty wide polling lead for most of the cycle, and although it has closed in, he could still win by over 6 points, in my opinion. Dr. Oz's favorables aren't exactly super high, so I could see John Fetterman getting a lot of working class vote. He would win by a likely margin. I don't think he'd quite get to the safe margin, but I think he could win by 8 or 9. The next likely Democrat state is going to be the state of Georgia. Herschel Walker had a pretty big scandal last week, and that's probably going to affect him. I don't think he's going to actually lose by a likely margin, but I do think Warnock would win by a likely margin in the best case scenario if these scandals keep bringing down Walker. He could even win without going to a runoff, honestly, in his best case scenario. The final likely Democrat state is going to be the state of Arizona. Mark Kelly is leading the polls by around 5 points right now. I could see him overperforming. Sometimes polls underestimate Republicans in Arizona. I don't think they are this year, but they do happen sometimes. So if that happens again, we could see Mark Kelly winning by a likely margin. All right, next I'm going to fill in the likely states, likely Republican states, starting with the state of Iowa. Chuck Grassley is very popular. He's probably going to win by 15 points in the general election, but I could see it dropping below 10 in the Democrats' best case scenario, so I am going to call Iowa likely Republican. South Carolina is a similar story to the governor election that I mentioned earlier. It can drop below 10 in a really blue year. So even though I think Tim Scott's going to win pretty easily, it could drop below 10. So I'm calling South Carolina likely Republican. So I've got all the solid and likely states filled out already. Democrats already have the majority in this scenario with 50 seats. That's all they need because Harris would break the tie. But I'm going to fill out the rest of the map anyway, starting with Nevada. Nevada would be a lean Democrat state in the Democrats' best case scenario. Cortez Masto, she's behind in the polls, but again, Nevada polls can sometimes overestimate Republicans. I could see her winning by close to 5 points in her best case scenario. Oklahoma's special election, I do think would be likely Republican. I hesitated earlier. I was going to put in the solid Republican, but there have been some polls showing it to be kind of close. I don't think it's going to be, but in the best case scenario, I think it would be below 10. Next up is the state of Missouri. Missouri has a tendency to be kind of close sometimes. I don't think it's going to be close this year, but it could be lean Republican if the stars align perfectly for the Democrats. So I'm going to call it lean Republican. Next up is the state of Wisconsin. I think Mandela Barnes, in the best case scenario, would narrowly win. I think he'd win by around 2 points. Ron Johnson's probably going to win this seat by a relatively wide margin. Polls usually underestimate Republicans in Wisconsin, and he's leading right now. But let's say that they don't and that Mandela Barnes comes back. I think he could win in the best case scenario. So I'm calling Wisconsin lean Republican. In the state of Florida, I do think Marco Rubio would very narrowly win in the Democrats' best case scenario. He's probably going to win by close to 10 or maybe even over 10 in real life. I could see it getting kind of close, but I do still think he'd win in the best case scenario for Democrats. In the state of Ohio, polls do have this close. I think Tim Ryan could very narrowly win in the best case scenario. Let's say that everything goes right for Democrats. Tim Ryan is really able to pick off the working class white voter that Trump was able to win in 2016 and 2020. I think he'd be able to beat Vance in the best case scenario. Finally, the state of North Carolina. I think it's going to vote to the left of Wisconsin in the general election this November. I think it could happen in the Democrats' best case scenario too. I think Sherry Beasley could probably win by 3 if everything aligns right for her. I don't think she's going to win, but in the best case scenario, I think she could. So this is the Democrats' best case scenario in the Senate this November, in my opinion. They would have 54 seats because they would pick up Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina and hold on to all their other seats. I'm going to do a video like this for the Republicans in a couple days, but until then, if you like my content, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload. Leave a like and comment, tell me what you think of the video, and thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day.